A body comes out of flat water, not the rapid, but the calm pool just below it. Above, a rescue beacon already climbs toward a satellite. At Hance Rapid, mile 77, the Park Service has written nearly the same death notice 3 times. Crocker, 2021. Kelly, 2022. Benjamin, 2026. Same rapid, same wording. Every beacon worked. This canyon runs 277 miles. Its walls stand a mile tall, its water near 50 degrees all year. You think whitewater kills here? It doesn't. The dead all wore life jackets. The trap was built by a dam and a storm nobody ever saw. Hold on that word, because it does most of the work in this story. Trap. Not a stretch of bad luck, not a run of careless people, not a river that happens to be strong. A trap is something engineered, something with parts that fit together, something that waits. And the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon is exactly that. It is one of the most managed rivers on the planet. Its flow is decided in an office. Engineers at Glen Canyon Dam pick how many thousands of cubic feet per second leave the base of that concrete wall, and they can change it hour by hour to match the price of electricity in Phoenix and Los Angeles. The water level below the dam rises and falls on a schedule that has almost nothing to do with rain. Guides know the flow before they launch. The Weather Service forecasts the canyon to the hour. Commercial trips are run by professionals who have made the same run 100 times, who can name every rapid in order, who know where the current will try to put them at each one. And people keep dying in the same handful of places, doing almost everything right. That is the thing you have to sit with, because it breaks the story you would expect. In a wild place, you assume the danger is wildness, and you assume that as we tame the place, control the water, forecast the weather, professionalize the guiding, wire the canyon for instant communication, the dying should taper off towards zero. It has not. And in several specific, provable ways, the taming is what loaded the trap. The dam did not make the canyon safe. The dam changed what kills you and when. To see how, you have to start at the top, where the river is still just a river, and follow it down into the ground, one mechanism at a time, until the pieces lock together, and you understand why the same death notice keeps getting written at mile 77. The canyon begins at a place called Lee's Ferry. On the maps, it is mile 0, the point where river trips launch, a narrow break in the cliffs where a road actually reaches the water, the last road that will touch the river for a very long way. Behind you upstream is the dam and the reservoir. Ahead of you is the canyon, and once you push off from that beach, you are committed to a corridor with almost no exits. From Lee's Ferry, the Colorado runs 277 miles to the Grand Wash Cliffs, where the walls finally fall away and the canyon ends. Over that distance, the river drops around 1,900 feet. That number by itself sounds gentle. Spread 1,900 feet of fall over 277 miles, and you get a slope so shallow you would not notice it standing on the bank. If the drop were even, this would be one of the calmest big rivers in North America. A long, cold, quiet float between enormous walls, more lake than river for most of its length. The raw numbers of this place mean almost nothing until you turn them into things a body can feel, because thrown around as statistics, they slide right past you. 277 miles is not a figure on a chart. It is a distance that takes a rowing trip 2 weeks or more to cross. 2 weeks in which, for most of that length, there is no road, no town, no cell signal, no way out except forward on the water or straight up a mile of cliff. A mile deep is not a postcard. Stand at the bottom, and the rim is a thin, bright edge so far above you that a person standing on it would be invisible, and the sun only finds the water for a few hours before the walls take it back. 50 degrees does not sound deadly because you have felt 50-degree air and shrugged it off. But 50-degree water pulls heat out of a body roughly 25 times faster than air of the same temperature. fast enough to disable a strong swimmer in minutes, and that is the whole difference between a cool day and a killing one. And the flows the dam releases, 10 or 15,000 cubic feet per second on an ordinary day, mean that every second, a volume of cold water the size of a small house goes by, all of it heading for the next constriction. Hold those four numbers in your body: the distance, the depth, the temperature, the flow. Because every death in this story happens where two or three of them meet, but the drop is not even. Not close. Roughly half of that entire 1,900-foot descent happens in about 10% of the distance. Think about what that means physically. For most of the canyon, the river is nearly flat, sliding along at a walking pace, deep and smooth and cold. Water so calm you can hear your own voice echo off a wall a quarter-mile away. And then, at scattered points, the river falls off a step. All the descent the flat water saved up gets spent at once, in a few hundred yards, and then the river goes flat again. The danger here is not spread across the map like a stain. It is concentrated into points, sharp, specific, named points. Hance, Sauk-de-Lager, Grapevine, Crystal, Lava Falls. The same names over and over in the incident reports, in the guidebooks, in the death notices the Park Service has to write and post. And here is the detail that sharpens the pattern into something that feels almost deliberate. The worst of those points are not scattered evenly down the 277 miles. They cluster tightly in the stretches where the canyon is narrowest and its rock is oldest and hardest. The Colorado has cut down through more than 1 billion years of stacked stone to reach the very bottom of the sequence. The basement rocks, dark twisted schist and pink granite close to 2 billion years old, some of the oldest exposed rock on the continent. Rock so hard and so tight that where the river runs through it, the walls close in from miles apart at the distant rim to a bare, black, vertical slot at the water. That reach is called the Inner Gorge, and it is exactly where the Killing Rapids live. Hance sits at the head of it. Sauk-de-Lager and Grapevine come right behind, names the old boatman said with the tone you would use for a bad dog. It is no accident that the deadliest water and the hardest, tightest rock share the same miles. Where the walls pinch in, a debris fan does not have to be large to choke the river, and a person who comes out of the water there has the least room, the fewest eddies to catch, and the fewest ways up and out of anywhere in the entire canyon. The geology does not merely build the rapids. It decides where they will be worst, and then it places the worst of them precisely where a human being has the least chance of escaping. When people say the canyon is a mile deep, that number is not scenery. A mile of vertical rock above your head is a mile of rock between a hurt person and the rim, between the rim and a road, between a radio call and a stretcher. The depth that makes the view unforgettable is the same depth that makes the rescue nearly impossible. So the first real question is not why the Grand Canyon is dangerous. That is the lazy question, and it has a lazy answer: big river, big walls, cold water. The first real question is why the danger sits in points at all. What makes a point? Why does a river that spends most of its length being calm suddenly, at mile 77 and mile 98 and mile 179, turn into something that kills people who are wearing life jackets and are pulled out of the water within minutes by their own friends? The answer is the single most important fact in this entire story, and almost nobody who floats the canyon fully understands it while they are in it. The rapids of the Grand Canyon are not carved by the Colorado River. The river did not make them. The river, left to itself, would grind them down and smooth them out. The rapids are dumped into the river from the sides, delivered by something that is not the river at all. Here is the mechanism, and I want you to see it as a physical chain, link by link, because every death downstream hangs off it. The Grand Canyon is not one canyon. It is a main canyon fed by hundreds of side canyons, tributaries that are dry most of the year, steep and narrow slots that climb thousands of feet up toward the rim. Those side canyons are steep for a specific reason. The main Colorado has cut down so deep, so fast in geologic terms, that every tributary feeding it has had to cut down just as hard to keep up, racing to match the level of the master river. The result is a network of near-vertical rock chutes hanging above the water, each one a loaded ramp pointed straight at the river. When a storm sits over the rim and it rains hard on that high desert, the water does not soak in. The ground up there is rock and thin soil, and in the summer monsoon the rain comes in short, violent bursts the ground cannot absorb. So the water runs. It gathers in those steep side canyons and it comes down them. And it does not come down as clear water. As it goes, it rips up loose rock, sand, and mud, and the mixture thickens until it is no longer water, carrying some sediment, but sediment carrying some water. Geologists call it a debris flow, and the numbers are hard to believe. The moving mass can be more than half solid material by weight, dense enough and thick enough to behave like wet concrete pouring downhill, dense enough to float boulders the size of cars and buses on its surface the way ordinary water floats a stick. It moves fast, 10, 15 miles an hour or more down a steep chute. With a front edge, a snout, of tumbling rock that grinds and booms as it comes. USGS scientists who have spent careers studying these events, researchers like Robert Webb and Theodore Mellis, have documented that the Grand Canyon's tributaries produce debris flows on the order of once or twice a year somewhere in the system, and that these flows, not the river, are what maintain and rebuild the rapids. That debris flow reaches the bottom, hits the Colorado, and stops. The water in it drains away downstream. The mud and sand wash out over the following weeks. But the boulders do not wash out. They are too big for the modern river to move, so they pile up right where the side canyon meets the main channel, building a fan of rock, a debris fan, that shoves out into the river like a dam built sideways. That fan is the rapid. It narrows the channel, sometimes to a fraction of its former width, and it steepens the bed. Every gallon the river was carrying still has to get through, but now it has to squeeze through a gap half the size or less, and pour over a fresh pile of rock. Squeezed and dropped, the water accelerates, stacks up into standing waves, curls back over the biggest submerged boulders into holes, and slams into the deep, slow pool below. That is a rapid, not something the river built over 10,000 years. Something a single rainstorm on the rim delivered in an afternoon, one boulder at a time, into a place the river now has to fight through forever. If you want to see this mechanism at its most extreme, go to mile 179 to a rapid called Lava Falls, set among the black basalt of old volcanic flows in the Western Canyon, widely regarded as the biggest, most violent navigable drop on the whole river. Lava Falls is fed by a side canyon called Prospect Canyon, and Prospect Canyon is one of the most active debris flow producers in the entire system. The rapid drops something like 13 feet in the space of a few hundred feet of river, an almost vertical staircase of exploding water, and it does not sit still from year to year. After a big debris flow comes out of Prospect, the rapid rearranges itself. Rocks appear where a clean line used to run. A route that worked last season stops working. The tongue of smooth water at the entrance shifts sideways. Guides who have run Lava Falls dozens of times still climb out onto the bank above it every single time and scout it on foot, walking down along the rocks to study the current for long minutes before they commit, because they know that what they memorized last year may have been quietly rewritten by a storm they never heard about. That is the discipline the mechanism forces on the people who are best at this. Never trust your memory of the water, because the water is not the same water, and the rocks beneath it may not be the same rocks. United States Geological Survey scientists have spent decades cataloging these events, mapping which tributaries delivered debris flows and how often, measuring how far each fresh fan shoves into the channel and how severely it constricts the flow, Precisely because a debris flow here is not a historical curiosity. It is a live, ongoing process that reshapes the hazard on the timescale of a single storm. The canyon the guides run this year is a slightly different canyon than the one they ran last year, and the difference is written in boulders, and the weather that writes it has a season. Most of these debris flows come in the late summer during the monsoon, when moist air pushes up over the southwest and builds towering thunderstorms over the high country in the afternoons. Storms that can dump an inch of rain on a single-side canyon in under an hour and send a debris flow down before the sky has even finished darkening. A smaller share come in winter, from long soaking rains on melting snow, which is what fed the Great Crystal Storm of 1966. Either way, the storms fall on the rim and the plateaus, thousands of feet above and often miles back from the river, on ground the boaters below will never see. So a guide can be floating a calm, sunlit reach in August while 10 miles away and half a mile up, a black cloud is loading a side canyon that will rearrange a rapid he has to run tomorrow. The hazard is not only built somewhere else, it is built on its own calendar in a season by storms that come and go without the river ever clouding over. This is why local knowledge in this canyon has always been, at bottom, weather knowledge. The ability to look up at the rim and read what the water down here is about to become. Read that chain again and notice exactly where the weather is in it. The rain that builds a rapid at mile 98 might fall miles away and thousands of feet up. On a plateau, the river's surface never feels. A person floating the calm water below could be in bright, still sunshine. The storm that built the rapid he is about to hit could have happened a century ago, or 3 years ago, or last week, and he would have no way to read it off the water. The danger is manufactured by weather that never touches the river. It is built somewhere else, at a different time, and shipped down a side canyon into his path. This is the first thing the canyon teaches, and the first thing it hides. The water you can see is not where the threat is made. There is a discipline that grows out of all this, and it is worth watching the people who are good at it. On a serious rapid, a guide does not simply float into it and hope. Where the water allows, they pull the boats into an eddy above the drop, climb out onto the rocks, and scout it on foot, walking down along the bank to study the current from the side, picking the line, the tongue of smooth water at the entrance, the holes to avoid, the wave that will try to turn the boat, the exact place they want to be at the bottom. They set safety, positioning people with throw ropes downstream, ready to reach a swimmer if a boat flips. And then they choose read and run, or scout and run, or, when the rapid is bad enough or the flow is wrong, portage, unloading the boats and carrying everything around by land, or lining the empty boats down along the shore by rope. That decision, whether to run it or walk it, is the single most important judgment a guide makes, and the good ones make it conservatively, because they understand the geometry that catches everyone else. Above many of these rapids there is a point beyond which there is no eddy to catch, no way to stop, no way back upstream against the current. Once you are past it, you are running the rapid whether you chose to or not. The river does not offer a pause. So the whole art is in the decisions made above that line, in the calm water, with time to think, because below it, there are no decisions left, only the line you picked and the cold water waiting to test it. And once the river is forced through the constriction, it does specific things to a human body that the flat water above never could. In the narrow, the current is not just fast, it is disorganized, three-dimensional, violent in ways still water never is. Water pouring over a submerged boulder plunges down and curls back on itself and forms a hole, a recirculating pocket where the surface water is actually flowing upstream, back toward the drop, so that a swimmer or a boat caught in it can be held in place, cycled, refusing to flush downstream. Water squeezed hard against a canyon wall rears up into a lateral wave that can catch the side of a raft and flip it as cleanly as flipping a coin. And at the very bottom, where the fast tongue of the rapid drives back into the deep, slow water of the pool, the river folds over itself, water going down and water coming up in the same place. That fold, the boil line at the tail of the rapid, is where things that go under tend to come back up. It is precisely the flat water below the rapid. It is the exact place the body came out in the opening of this story, and the beacon was already climbing over it before the group had finished pulling him from the pool. Keep that geometry in your head. The killing happens at the top, in the churn. The body surfaces at the bottom, in the calm. People see the calm water and cannot understand how anyone died there. The whole answer is that they did not die there. They died 200 yards upstream, at the top, and the river simply delivered them down. Walk through what a swim in one of these rapids actually is, because it explains why being pulled out fast is not the same as being saved. A person goes into the water at the top, in the churn, and the first thing that happens is that the river takes away their footing and their orientation completely. They are tumbled, pushed down, brought up, spun, in water that is half air and gives nothing to push against. If they are lucky, the current carries them down the main tongue and flushes them out the bottom into the pool where the group can reach them. If they are unlucky, they wash into a hole, one of those recirculating pockets behind a boulder, and the hole does not let go. It cycles them, pulls them back under the falling water, brings them up, pulls them back, and a swimmer caught in a strong hole can be held for a long time, while the group on shore can do almost nothing but throw a rope and hope the swimmer can catch it and hold on. And here is where the cold reaches into the mechanics of the swim. Catching and holding a rope requires working hands and arms, and cold water takes exactly those first. The rescue technique is sound, the throw is accurate, the rope lands across the swimmer, and the swimmer's cold hands will not close on it. The river does not need to hold a person under for long. It only needs to hold them until the cold has taken their grip and their breath. And in 50-degree water, that does not take long at all. Getting a body back to the boat in minutes is a triumph of teamwork that, against this particular river, often arrives just behind the thing that mattered. The people who lived in and around this canyon longest understood its shape better than any of the men who later came to conquer it. And they understood it by refusing to do the one thing those men insisted on doing. The Havasupai, whose own name for themselves means the people of the blue-green water, farmed a side canyon so beautiful it is still one of the most famous places on Earth, growing corn and beans and squash on the very benches and fans that the floods and debris flows had built, using the tributary as a home rather than treating the main river as a road. They are still there. The Hualapai held the rims and drainages to the west and south. The southern Paiute, including the Kaibab Band, ranged the high plateaus to the north. The Hopi kept trails into the canyon and made salt-gathering pilgrimages down specific, named brutally steep routes, down and back up, using the side canyons as ladders. Ancestral Puebloan people, long before all of them, left granaries tucked into the cliffs, storing crops grown on the deltas of the tributaries. One place on the river holds much of that history in a single view. Around mile 61, the Little Colorado River comes in from the east, and when it is not in flood, it runs an unearthly turquoise blue, colored by dissolved minerals, pouring its warm, bright water into the cold green Colorado. To the Hopi, the country around that confluence is sacred ground, tied to the very origin of their people, and their trails came down to it across the desert from the mesas far to the east. It is one of the most beautiful spots in the entire canyon, and it is also, in its own way, a lesson in the same mechanism, because the Little Colorado is itself a flash flood river, able to turn from turquoise to raging brown in a matter of hours when a storm hits its enormous watershed upstream and able to drive its own debris and sediment into the main river. The confluence is a place people have revered and used and crossed for a very long time, and they used it the way they used everything here, by knowing its moods, by reading the sky above the watershed, by treating a beautiful place as a dangerous one that happened also to be beautiful. The reverence and the caution were never separate things. They were the same knowledge, worn smooth by generations. That pattern is the whole lesson. For centuries, the people who knew this place used the canyon by climbing into it and out of it at specific, tested points, crossing the main stem only at known fords where the river spread wide and shallow, and treating the deep river through the inner gorge as a barrier to be respected rather than a highway to be ridden. They did not float it end to end. Not because they lacked boats or nerve or skill, but because the accumulated knowledge of many generations told them the same thing the modern death notices tell us. The big river through the Narrows is a place where your options close behind you and do not reopen. That restraint was not fear. It was the highest form of local competence, a whole system of observation about where water gathered, where flash floods came, which crossings were safe in which season, which side canyons would kill you if a cloud showed up on the rim. The most experienced people in the canyon's long human history were precisely the ones who chose not to run the river. Be exact about what that knowledge was, because it is easy to romanticize it and miss the point. It was not mystical. It was a working body of observation, built and corrected across many generations, about how water behaves in this specific landscape. It was knowing that a dark cloud stacking up over the rim on a summer afternoon could send a wall of water down a side canyon hours later and miles away into a slot that had been bone dry and sunlit when you walked into it, which is the very same flash flood mechanism, read from the human side, that builds the rapids. It was knowing which crossings could be waded in which season, when the river dropped low enough and slow enough to be a ford rather than a grave. It was knowing which benches flooded and which were safe to build a granary on, knowledge paid for by the generations who guessed wrong. The people who held it did not conquer the river and did not pretend it was tame. They fitted themselves to it, moving on its schedule rather than their own, and treated its worst places as walls to go around rather than doors to go through. Set that against the men who came later, with a survey season to finish, a railroad grade to prove, pay or a payroll to meet, a permit that launches on a fixed date whether the water likes it or not. The deepest divide in this whole story is not between old boats and new boats, or between a wild river and a dammed one. It is between moving on the river's schedule and forcing the river onto yours. Nearly everyone who has died here was, in some form, on a schedule the river never agreed to. So what happened when outsiders decided the river was a route after all? What happened the first time men looked at those long stretches of quiet flat water, saw a smooth surface and a low grade, and concluded the whole thing could be floated like a graded road to the sea? The first man to find out on an industrial scale was named Frank Mason Brown, and he did not come to explore. He came to build a railroad. It was 1889, and Brown was president of a venture with a name as confident as the plan behind it, the Denver, Colorado Canyon, and Pacific Railroad. The idea was a rail line laid right down at the water's edge, following the Colorado from the coal fields near Grand Junction all the way to the Pacific coast, a low, flat, gentle grade that would haul coal and freight where no line had ever gone. On paper, the logic was excellent. Rivers find the lowest, gentlest path through mountains. A railroad that simply followed the river to the sea would avoid the punishing climbs and switchbacks that had bankrupted other lines. All Brown had to do was survey the route, prove the grade was buildable, and the investor's money would follow. He launched a survey crew with a set of boats that told you everything about how badly he had misread the place. Thin, light boats built of cedar, chosen for speed and easy handling on calm water, exactly wrong for a river that turns violent at points. And most damning of all, no life preservers aboard. Sit with that decision, because it is the entire tragedy compressed into a single equipment choice. Brown looked at the low, slow, warm July water at the top of the run and provisioned for that water. He did not provision for the points. He was running a route, on a schedule, with investors watching from Denver and a survey season that would not wait for caution. And every one of those pressures, the money, the calendar, the need to look decisive and lean, pushed him toward light, fast, cheap, and now. This is the practical pressure that shapes almost every disaster in this canyon, and it was there at the very beginning. The mission had a deadline, and the deadline argued against the gear that keeps you alive. To see why Brown could not simply stop, you have to see the machine standing behind him. This was not a lone adventurer following a whim. It was a corporation with investors who had put real money into the promise of a coal railroad to the Pacific. And the entire value of that promise depended on proving the grade before the money ran out and before some competitor claimed the route first. Brown had raised the funds on his own confidence, and confidence is a currency that collapses the instant its owner turns back. A survey that halts halfway, that admits the river is worse than advertised, that goes home to ask for heavier boats and safety gear, is a survey that tells its backers the whole venture may be impossible, and Brown could not afford to say that out loud. So the warnings, the repeated swampings, the near misses, the plain fragility of the cedar boats were not read as what they were, which was the river stating exactly what it would do to unprepared men. They were read as ordinary hardship, the friction any bold project has to push through. A matter of grit rather than a matter of physics. That is the most dangerous way a warning can ever be misread. Not ignored, but reinterpreted as a test of resolve. And once you have decided that the river's warnings are merely obstacles to your determination, every warning drives you further in instead of pulling you back, because turning around would mean admitting the warnings were real all along. Brown pressed on because stopping had been made unthinkable by the very structure of his own venture. The river does not care what a venture can afford. The warnings came fast, and they came clearly. The boats swamped again and again in the early rapids of Marble Canyon, taking on water, spinning, dumping men and equipment into the river. Brown's chief engineer, a serious and experienced man named Robert Brewster Stanton, watched it happen and understood exactly what the swampings were telling him. Light boats and no flotation were not survivable if this continued. But understanding a warning and being able to act on it are two entirely different things, and the momentum of the expedition, the investment already sunk, the distance already covered, the difficulty of stopping and refitting deep in a canyon, carried the crew downstream past the point where turning back was easy, into water that only got more serious. On July 10, 1889, at a rapid near mile 11 or 12, Frank Brown's boat overturned in the current. By the accounts that survive, it was not even in the worst of the water when it went over. More a strong eddy and a bad moment than a great violent rapid. Brown was in the river. He surfaced, and there was nothing to hold him up. No preserver, nothing. And the cold and the current took him in moments, in water that a calmer eye would have called nothing much. His body was never recovered. The president of the railroad, the man whose confidence had built the entire expedition around light boats and no flotation, was gone in a stretch of river that did not look like it could kill anyone. That should have ended the survey. It did not. The pressure that had killed Brown was still there, and the survivors pushed on. 5 days later, on July 15th, 2 more men, Peter Hansbrough and Henry Richards, drowned at what is now called 25 Mile Rapid, farther into Marble Canyon. 3 men dead in less than a week, and now finally, the survivors did the thing the canyon actually rewards. They stopped fighting the route. They cached the boats and the surviving equipment in a large cave high in the limestone wall, a cave that still carries Stanton's name today, and they climbed out of the canyon on foot, up a side drainage, abandoning the mission in order to save the living. They treated the walls as the exit and the tributary as the ladder, exactly as the people who had lived here for centuries would have done. And they lived. Sit with what those 2 weeks proved, because the rest of this story is built on it and keeps proving it. 3 men died. Not one of them died, because the white water was so violent that no human could have survived it. Brown died in something close to an eddy. What killed all 3 was the same combination: no flotation, cold water, fast current, and no immediate way out. Flotation and the exit decide who lives here. The violence of the whitewater is almost beside the point. 130 years of Grand Canyon fatalities would go on proving that single sentence over and over, and it was already fully written in the summer of 1889 in cedar boats before anyone had ever heard the word rafting. Now here is the first great reversal, and it matters because it sets the exact pattern that every later technological fix will follow. Robert Stanton did not accept that the river had beaten him. He went home, and he did something rare and admirable. He analyzed precisely what had gone wrong, isolated the causes, and came back that winter having engineered them away. New boats, this time built of oak, heavy and strong, able to take a beating that would have shattered the thin cedar, and cork life preservers for every man on the crew. He had identified the 2 things that killed Brown and Hansbrough and Richards: no flotation and fragile hulls, and he had solved both. In the winter of 1889 into 1890, Stanton ran the entire canyon, survived the rapids that had destroyed the first attempt, took photographs, and completed the survey all the way through. He proved you could float the Colorado from end to end and come out alive. The equipment appeared to solve the problem. Appeared to. Watch that word, because it is going to come back wearing different clothes at every stage of this story. Stanton had solved the problem of his own expedition, and by solving it, he had proved the river was passable. And a passable river is a river that fills up with people. Better boats did not make the Colorado safer. Better boats made the Colorado reachable. And a reachable canyon fills with people who will not have Stanton's oak boats, or his life preservers, or his caution, or the hard, expensive understanding he had bought with 3 men's lives. The fix worked, and precisely because it worked, it guaranteed the next generation of deaths by inviting in everyone who would come after. That is not a paradox, and it is not irony for its own sake. It is the engine of this entire story, and it just turned over for the first time. Every improvement in this canyon expands the number of people exposed to the parts of the trap that no improvement has touched. Hold that. We are going to watch it happen again with a dam and again with a satellite phone. And the railroad? It was never built. The grade Stanton proved buildable was never worth building, and the coal trains he imagined running along the water's edge never ran. But the survey had done its real work, which was not commercial at all. It had shown the outside world that the Grand Canyon could be run, and it had produced the first serious photographic record of the inner gorge. And it had planted the idea that this was a place a person might go through on purpose and live. Think for a moment about what Stanton's winter run actually took, because it deepens the point. He went back into the canyon in the cold months deliberately, when the water ran lower and the rapids at low water were in some ways less overwhelming, and he carried a photographer and heavy glass plate camera gear to document the grade, foot by foot, which meant stopping constantly, hauling fragile equipment over rock, working in a gorge where the winter sun reaches the water for only a few hours a day and the cold settles in early. It was slow, meticulous, disciplined work, the exact opposite of Brown's rushed summer dash, and it succeeded precisely because it refused to be rushed. Stanton had learned in blood the lesson the first trip taught. The canyon punishes the schedule and rewards the patience. And still, being survivable is not the same as being safe. A canyon does not become safe because one careful man crossed it once. It becomes known, which is an entirely different thing. And a known danger draws far more people into it than an unknown one ever could. Every photograph Stanton carried out was, in a sense, an advertisement, proof that the impossible river had a bottom you could reach and a far end you could get to. The survey meant to sell a railroad ended up selling the canyon itself to everyone who came after. But before we follow the boats forward into the age of the dam, we have to go back 20 years to the man who ran the canyon first because his expedition proved something Stanton's did not, something even more important and more disturbing about where the real trap lies. In 1869, John Wesley Powell, a Civil War veteran who had lost most of his right arm at Shiloh and had become a self-taught scientist, led the first known expedition to run the Grand Canyon. 10 men, 4 wooden boats, launched from Green River, Wyoming, in May of that year, down the Green to the Colorado and into the canyons below. They had no maps of what was ahead. They did not know how far it was. They did not know whether the river dropped off a great waterfall somewhere in the middle of the unexplored gorge that would kill every one of them at once. They were doing the single most dangerous thing you can do in a canyon like this, which is enter it without knowing where the points are, floating blind toward drops they could not see until they were on top of them. It went wrong early and stayed hard. In the canyons of the Green, well before the Grand Canyon itself, one of the boats, the No Name, was swept into a rapid the men afterward called Disaster Falls and smashed to pieces on the rocks. The crew survived, but the expedition lost a third of its instruments and a large share of its food in that one wreck, and it never recovered from the loss. One man, Frank Goodman, had had enough and left the expedition when he got the chance. The others pushed on, down through canyon after canyon, the food spoiling as they went, the flour soured and sifted through mosquito netting to get the lumps out, the bacon gone rancid, the men living on less and less as the walls got higher and the summer wore on. By the time they reached the depths of the Grand Canyon in late August, they were exhausted, half-starved, their boats battered and leaking, rowing into what Powell called the Great Unknown, with almost nothing left. The daily reality of that last stretch is hard to imagine now, floating past the same walls in a modern boat with coolers of food. Powell's men were rationing spoiled flour and rancid bacon and a little coffee. Portaging and lining the heavy wooden boats around rapids they judged too dangerous to run, which meant unloading everything, muscling the boats along the rocks by rope, hauling the gear over boulders, and reloading over and over, a labor that burned the calories they no longer had to spare. The boats leaked and had to be recaulked. The instruments that survived the earlier wreck had to be protected. Every rapid presented the same brutal arithmetic: run it and risk the boat and the men, or portage it and spend the strength they were running out of. And every day the wall seemed higher, and the way out seemed further. They did not know how many more miles of this lay ahead, and that not knowing was its own weight because a man can endure almost anything he can see the end of, and they could not see the end of this. By late August, they were near the limit of what bodies can do, and it was into that exhaustion, not into fresh nerve, that the worst rapid arrived. And then they came to a rapid that looked worse than anything behind them. A choked, roaring drop between sheer dark walls of the oldest rock in the canyon, with no clean line visible through it. Three of the men had reached the absolute end of what they could take. Orrimal Howland, his younger brother Seneca Howland, and William Dunn looked at that rapid and made a decision that from where they were standing was completely rational. They judged that running the rapid in their wrecked boats, starving, was very likely to kill them, and that their better odds lay in climbing out of the canyon on foot, up a side canyon to the north rim, and walking overland to a Mormon settlement they believed lay within reach. On August 28, 1869, at the place forever after called Separation Canyon, the three men shook hands with the others, left the river, and started up the wall. The men who stayed ran the rapid. It was as bad as it looked, but the boats came through, and within a day or two the survivors were out of the worst of the inner gorge and into calmer, wider water, and shortly after that they reached the mouth of the Virgin River and safety, ragged and starving and alive. The expedition succeeded. The river, which had looked like certain death, had been the survivable choice. The three men who climbed out were never seen again. What happened to them up on that high, dry country is one of the enduring, unsolved arguments of the American West. And I am going to give it to you exactly as honestly as the record allows, because this story has no need for invented drama. And the truth here is genuinely disputed. Powell's account, the one he carried out of the canyon and repeated for the rest of his life, was that the three men were killed by a band of Shivwits Paiutes who took them for someone else, men who had wronged the tribe, and killed them in a case of mistaken identity. That is the version that entered the history books. But other accounts surfaced over the years pointing in a very different direction, suggesting the three were killed, not by native people at all, but by Mormon settlers in that isolated region, in the tense years after the Mountain Meadows killings, for reasons that had nothing to do with the river and everything to do with fear and mistrust of strangers. The evidence on both sides is thin, late, and contradictory. Honest historians say plainly that the exact truth has never been established and probably never will be. I am not going to pretend to resolve it, because pretending would be exactly the kind of manufactured certainty this story refuses. Powell himself went on to run the river a second time, in 1871 and 1872, this time with better boats, steadier funding, and a real mandate to map, and it was that second, more scientific expedition that produced the careful surveys and many of the names that stuck, and that helped turn Powell into one of the most powerful figures in American science, eventually the head of the Geological Survey, the man who tried to tell a young country how to think honestly about the water limits of the arid West. And yet the one thing he could never fully account for was what had become of the three men who trusted the land over the water at Separation. Researchers have returned to that question for a century and a half, digging through Mormon records and Paiute accounts and the physical ground itself, and it remains open, a genuine, unsolved case, sitting at the exact spot where three men made the most fateful navigational decision of the entire first expedition, which was to stop navigating. The place is still called Separation Canyon. It is one of the few names on this river that marks not a rock or a rapid, but a choice. And the choice was to leave the water. And the water was the thing that would have saved them. But the lesson does not depend on who killed them. The lesson is in the geometry, and the geometry is brutal and clear. Three men decided the river was the deadlier option and chose the land. The men who trusted the river lived. The men who left the river died. In this canyon, the walls are not the escape from the trap. Very often, the walls are the trap. Climbing out of the inner gorge puts you into thousands of vertical feet of waterless desert rock, in heat that can kill in a day, with no shelter, no water, and, once you are up on the rim country, enormous distances between you and anyone who can help. The safest path through the inner gorge is very frequently the river itself, which raises the question that carries us straight into the strangest and most modern part of this whole story. If the river is the safe way through, if trusting the water is the smart move, Then what happens when the river itself changes? What happens when the safe path stops being safe, not because of anything the people on it did wrong, but because of a storm they never saw, and a wall of concrete they had been promised made everything predictable? To answer that, we go to December 1966, and to a side canyon called Crystal Creek, and to the 4 days that rewrote the map. There was nothing special about Crystal Creek before that December. On the river charts of the day, it barely rated a mark. Where Crystal Creek met the Colorado, at about mile 98, there was a riffle, a minor wrinkle in the surface, the kind of thing a guide would name in passing, and the passengers would barely feel under the boat, a place to relax and look up at the walls. Boatmen ran it without a second thought. By the standards of the Grand Canyon, it was nothing at all. A gentle spot in a stretch of otherwise serious water. Then it began to rain on the Kaibab Plateau, the high forested country thousands of feet above the north side of the canyon. And it did not stop. Over roughly 76 hours in early December 1966, something on the order of 11 to 14 inches of rain fell on that high country, an extraordinary amount, warm rain falling on ground that could not begin to absorb it. The United States Geological Survey later studied the event in exhaustive detail in a document known as Professional Paper 980 and put a number on it that is hard to even picture. This was, by their analysis, an event of something close to 1,000-year magnitude, the kind of storm that ground might see once in a millennium, and it had settled over exactly the wrong plateau, feeding exactly the wrong side canyons. Up on the plateau, the water gathered and came down the side drainages, Dragon Creek and Milk Creek among them, funneling into Crystal Creek. And it came down not as a flood of water, but as a debris flow, at a scale the canyon had not seen in living memory. That dense, boulder-carrying slurry we walked through earlier, but enormous. It poured out of the mouth of Crystal Creek and slammed into the Colorado, and it dumped a debris fan into the main channel so large that it constricted the river to roughly a quarter of its former width. A quarter. Picture the entire Colorado, all of it, suddenly forced through a gap a fraction of the size it had occupied days before, pouring over a fresh mountain of boulders that simply had not existed the previous week. In about 4 days, the minor riffle at mile 98 became Crystal Rapid, one of the 2 or 3 most feared rapids in the entire canyon. A rapid with a hole in it big enough to swallow a large motor raft whole. Not eroded into being over 10,000 years by patient water. Built from the side, in a long December weekend, by a storm that not a single person on the river ever witnessed. The map was not fixed. The map was never fixed. A rapid that would go on to injure and kill people for the next half-century and beyond was delivered in 4 days. By rain falling on a plateau most of its future victims would never once set foot on. Everything the guides thought they knew about that stretch of river was obsolete inside a week. And Crystal was not the only rapid that Storm rewrote. That same enormous rainfall drove debris flows out of tributaries up and down that part of the canyon, reshaping other rapids, shifting other fans, so that when the boatmen returned the following season, they were, in places, running a river that no longer matched their memory or their notes. This is the part that unsettles people who assume a wilderness is a fixed and ancient thing, unchanged for 10,000 years, the same for your grandparents as for you. The Grand Canyon is not that. It is actively assembling itself, rapid by rapid, storm by storm. And the humans floating through are doing so during one particular arrangement of the furniture, an arrangement a single bad weekend on the rim can rearrange without asking. The guidebooks and the mental maps and the hard-won knowledge of exactly where the tongue runs and where the hole waits are all provisional, valid only until the next big flow down the next loaded side canyon. A guide learns this river not as a fixed text to be memorized once, but as a living document edited without warning by an author, the weather on the rim, who never signs the changes and never sends word that they have been made. Now hold that image. The fresh fan choking the Colorado at mile 98, and add the single fact that turns this from a natural event into an engineered one. 3 years earlier, in 1963, the gates had closed on Glen Canyon Dam, upstream at the very top of the canyon, and the reservoir called Lake Powell had begun to fill behind it. And the dam had just quietly switched off the one process that for all of geologic time before it had kept fans like crystals from taking permanent hold of the river. Here is what the dam removed, and it is the second great mechanism of this story, every bit as important as the debris flow, and far less obvious. Before the dam, the Colorado was a wild river with a wild river's seasons. Every spring, snow melting across the Rocky Mountains sent an enormous flood down the canyon. Not a rare disaster flood, an annual, expected gigantic pulse of water, often many times the ordinary summer flow, brown and thick with sediment, powerful beyond anything today's river ever shows. That annual flood did a job. Every year, when debris flows dumped new fans into the river, the next spring's flood would come roaring through with enough force and enough sediment and enough sheer weight of water to attack those fans, to pick up and roll and grind the boulders, to sweep the finer material downstream, and to reopen and reset the channel, keeping the constrictions from growing without limit. The river maintained itself. The floods were the maintenance crew, and they came every single year on nature's schedule, and no one had to decide anything. Glen Canyon Dam ended the floods. That is what a dam does, and in this case, it was the entire point. It catches the spring melt in the reservoir and lets the water out on a human schedule. A steady, managed flow sized for generating electricity and delivering water to the cities and farms of the Southwest, never the wild June surge. The intentions were serious and the benefits were real, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Flood control that protected downstream towns, water storage that let 7 states and Mexico share a river in a drought-prone desert, clean hydroelectric power for millions of people, and a river you could finally predict and plan around. But the predictable river had lost its maintenance crew. When Crystal's giant fan came down in December 1966, there was no longer any annual flood big enough to sweep it away. The dam had 3 years earlier switched off the one force that could have undone the damage, and so Crystal Rapid did not get flushed out and shrink back into a riffle over the following springs. It stayed. It is still there. Every debris flow in the decades since has added a little more to it, and nothing has ever fully taken any of it back. The river can no longer clean its own wounds. This is the reversal that reorganizes everything you thought you understood about safety in this canyon. The dam made the river feel safer, and in the narrow sense, it genuinely was easier to be on. Steady flows, no terrifying June surge, water levels a guide could predict to the hour and plan a trip around. And precisely because it made the river feel safe and predictable and manageable, the dam triggered a boom. Commercial river running, which before the dam had been a fringe pursuit for a tiny number of hardened, obsessive boatmen, exploded into a full industry through the 1960s and 1970s. Tens of thousands of ordinary people a year, most of whom had never done anything remotely like it, began floating the Grand Canyon, sold on the entirely reasonable promise that this was now a managed, professional, predictable experience with a trained guide on the oars. The control went deeper than just removing the flood. For most of the dam's history, the flow was tuned, hour by hour, to the demand for electricity. Higher through the day when air conditioners and factories pull power, lower at night, so that the river itself rose and fell, like a slow tide that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the electrical load in distant cities. A beach that was dry sand in the morning could be underwater by afternoon and dry again by dawn. The river breathing in and out on a schedule set by a power grid. boaters learned to tie their boats for a rising river overnight, because a craft left snug at a low evening flow could be floated off or swamped by the next day's higher release, or left stranded high and dry when the flow fell away. The single most basic fact about any river, how much water is in it right now, had been detached from nature and handed to an operator watching a load chart. That is the deepest sense in which this river is controlled. Not merely dammed, but dialed. Adjusted in real time to serve cities hundreds of miles away, a wild river reduced to an output. And here's the part that should stay with you. For all that command over how much water moves through the canyon at any given second, the two properties that actually decide who lives and dies in the rapids were fixed by the dam's design the day it was finished, and no dial in any control room can touch them now. And the dam did two more things at the same time, both invisible from a raft, both lethal. First, the water it releases does not come off the warm, sunlit surface of Lake Powell. It comes from deep in the reservoir, drawn through intakes hundreds of feet down from the cold, dark water near the bottom that the summer sun never reaches. So the river below the dam runs cold, near 50 degrees, all year, every single day. In the furnace heat of July exactly as much as in January. A wild June Colorado would have been warm on top, brown and warm from the sun and the desert. The dammed river is refrigerated. Second, the reservoir traps sediment. The Colorado was once one of the muddiest rivers on Earth, so thick with silt that early travelers said it was too thin to plow and too thick to drink. Now almost all of that sediment settles out in the still water of Lake Powell and stays there. The water that comes out the bottom of the dam is cold and clear, sediment-starved. And a sediment-starved river is a hungry river that erodes the beaches and sandbars downstream instead of building them, steadily stripping the canyon of the sandy camps and habitat the old floods used to renew. The change did not stop at the sand. It reached all the way into what lives in the river. Everything native to the Colorado here had evolved for the old water, warm and thick with silt, and torn open by an annual flood. And the strangest of those natives were the fish. The humpback chub, with its odd fleshy hump, and the razorback sucker, ancient species found nowhere else on Earth, shaped over millions of years for exactly that wild brown river. When the dam turned the water cold and clear almost overnight, it pulled the floor out from under them, and several slid toward the edge of extinction in the miles below the dam, hanging on now mainly where a warm tributary like the Little Colorado still pours in. The same cold, clear water that was poison to the natives was close to ideal for rainbow trout, a fish not native to the canyon at all, and trout moved in and thrived, so that the entire living system of the river quietly reorganized itself around the machine upstream. That is the reach of a single wall of concrete. It did not merely change how much water flows, or how cold it is, or how the beaches hold together. It swapped out the animals. And every piece of that transformation, the stranded native fish, the invading trout, the vanishing camps, the swelling rapids, traces back to the same two blunt facts about the water pouring from the base of the dam. It is cold, and it is clear. Those two properties rebuilt the ecosystem, starved the beaches, and at the top of a rapid, in the first minute of a swim, they kill people. The same two properties, doing all of it at once. Look at what the dam actually did, all of it together, because this is the whole system in one paragraph. It made the river feel safer, which put far more people on it than had ever been there before. It stopped the annual floods, which means the rapids only grow and never get flushed clean, and the beaches only shrink. And it turned the water permanently cold. Cold enough, as we will see, to shut down a healthy adult's ability to swim inside of a minute. A safer-feeling river, with permanently worsening rapids, permanently eroding camps, and permanently lethal water, now carrying tens of thousands of trusting people a year, who have been told, correctly in one sense and catastrophically in another, that the whole thing is under control. Every part of the trap was now built and in place. It just had not yet been sprung at full scale. That took a wet winter. It was sprung in June 1983, and it nearly took the dam itself with it. The winter of 1982 into 1983 buried the Rocky Mountains in snow, and then a warm, wet, sudden spring melted that snowpack fast, all at once. Far more water came pouring into Lake Powell than the forecasts had planned for. The reservoir, which the dam is supposed to use as a buffer, filled toward the very top, and it kept rising, with more water coming down out of the mountains every day. The engineers at Glen Canyon Dam found themselves in the exact situation a dam operator spends a career trying never to see. The reservoir climbing toward the crest of the dam, inflow exceeding everything they could pass through the power plant, and nowhere left to put the water except into the emergency spillways. The great concrete tunnels bored through the sandstone on either side of the dam that had been built for this and never once used. They opened the spillways, and the spillways began to come apart. As tens of thousands of cubic feet per second roared down those concrete-lined tunnels, something happened that the designers had underestimated: a phenomenon called cavitation. When water moves fast enough over a surface, the pressure in places drops so low that the water itself flashes into vapor bubbles. And when those bubbles collapse an instant later, they do so with tiny, ferocious implosions, hammer blows at a microscopic scale, repeated billions of times, that can chew through solid concrete and steel. Inside the spillway tunnels, the cavitation began tearing the concrete lining apart and digging into the sandstone behind it. Operators heard and felt a deep pounding through the structure. The water coming out the bottom of the spillways turned red, and then chunks of rock and shattered concrete came out with it, the tunnels excavating themselves from the inside. This was the machine that was supposed to represent total human control over the river, and it was being eaten alive by its own emergency release. The engineers did something that sounds almost comic against the scale of the crisis, and was in fact deadly serious. To buy capacity, to hold a little more water back in the reservoir, without sending more down the failing spillways, they raced to build up the top of the dam, bolting sheets of plywood, and then more permanent steel onto the tops of the spillway gates as makeshift flashboards, raising the effective height of the dam by a few feet, gambling that a wall of plywood and steel could hold back a rising reservoir long enough for the snowmelt to peak and drop. It held. Barely by most accounts, but it held. The reservoir crested just below disaster and began to fall, and the dam survived. But for a few weeks in the summer of 1983, the most controlled river in North America had come close to overwhelming the very structure that controlled it. And the people running that structure were nailing plywood to the top of it and hoping. When the water finally dropped and crews could climb into the spillway tunnels to see what the flood had done, nobody felt like celebrating. The cavitation had torn holes tens of feet deep into the concrete lining and the sandstone behind it, cavities excavated by nothing but fast water and collapsing vapor bubbles, inside a structure that had been engineered to last forever. The engineers understood they had found a real flaw, one the original calculations had simply missed. In the repairs that followed, they rebuilt the shattered concrete and cut aeration slots into the spillways, deliberate openings that mix air into the fast water, because air in the flow softens the tiny implosions of cavitation and keeps them from hammering the surface apart. It was good engineering, learned the hard way, and it braced the structure for the next flood. But sit for a second with what the whole episode says about the word control. A river that a nation had spent a fortune to command had, in a single wet spring, produced a flood powerful enough to begin dismantling the machine built to command it, from the inside, using the machine's own released water as the tool. The engineers did not defeat that river. They survived it, patched the wounds, and braced for the next round. Control here is not a settled achievement. It is a running argument with a river that keeps probing the gaps in the design, and the argument is never actually won. It is only continued. and all that water they were forced to release went down the canyon, into the rapids. They pushed releases past 70,000 cubic feet per second, roughly 3 or 4 times the ordinary managed flow, into a river whose modern rapids, Crystal chief among them, had been built and shaped entirely under the low, steady, post-dam regime of the previous 20 years. Crystal had never, in its short and violent life, seen a flood. It had been assembled at low water, and it had never been tested by high water. Now it was tested. A scientist named Susan Kiefer studied what Crystal became at those flows and published her analysis in the Journal of Geology in 1985. And her work is the reason we can describe what happened precisely instead of just dramatically. At around 70,000 cubic feet per second, the constriction at Crystal produced what fluid dynamics calls a hydraulic jump. Here is what that means where you can feel it. When a fast, relatively shallow sheet of water pouring over the fan meets the deep, slow water of the pool below, the flow has to abruptly transition from fast and shallow to slow and deep, and it does that by rearing up into a violent, breaking, standing wall of water that stays in one place while the entire river pours through it. Imagine a waterfall that does not move downstream, a permanent vertical wall of exploding whitewater fixed to one spot in the river, with the full weight of a flooding Colorado feeding it. That is a hydraulic jump, and Crystal at high water was a giant one. It was not a wave you ride over the top of. It was a wall that stopped boats and held them and worked them. Understand why a boat as large and stable as a motor rig flips in something like that? Because it is not the same as a boat being tipped by a big wave. A normal wave, even a huge one, moves, and a boat rides up its face and over its shoulder and down the far side, and the whole event is over in a couple of seconds. A hydraulic jump does not move. It is a standing wall of water pouring back on itself in one fixed place, fed continuously by the full weight of the river behind it. A boat driven into it does not ride over it. It drives into a moving mountain that keeps rebuilding itself, and the recirculating water at the base grabs the bow and stalls the boat while the current behind keeps pushing, and the boat stands up and stands further and goes over backward or sideways, and then the same recirculation that flipped it can hold it there, cycling it in place, holding the swimmers in the coldest, most violent water in the canyon. Power does not save you, because the wall is fed by more power than any outboard motor could ever match. Size does not save you because the wall is larger than the boat. Stability does not save you because stability is designed for waves that pass, and this wave does not pass. That is why the safe boat, the big, reliable motor rig chosen precisely so that nervous passengers would not be riding in a fragile craft, was exactly the boat that met the worst hydraulic in the canyon at the highest flow in its short history and lost. On June 25, 1983, a large motorized raft operated by the company Tour West came down into that. A motor rig is not a little paddle boat. It is a big, heavy, engine-driven pontoon craft, the very kind chosen precisely because it is stable and powerful and hard to flip. The boat you put nervous passengers on because it is the safe option. It hit the hydraulic jump at Crystal, and it flipped anyway, throwing its passengers into 50-degree water at the base of the worst hole in the canyon. One passenger drowned. Others were injured, some seriously, pulled from the cold river battered and hypothermic. The Park Service response was almost without precedent. They effectively closed the rapid. Helicopters flew the reach, dropping printed warning leaflets to the trips coming downstream, telling them in plain language what was waiting at Crystal. And the guidance became to stop, pull out above the rapid, and portage the passengers around it on foot rather than run it at those flows. In the modern, controlled, professionally guided Grand Canyon, the authorities had been reduced to airdropping paper warnings and marching tourists around a rapid on land. Picture what that actually looked like on the water. Trips coming downstream, having paid and planned and launched into what they believed was a managed river, would round a bend and find a helicopter working the reach overhead and printed sheets of paper drifting down, telling them that the rapid ahead had become something no one should run at this flow. They would pull in above Crystal, tie up, and begin the slow, awkward labor of getting everyone and everything past it on foot. Passengers picking their way along the rocks in life jackets, guides muscling gear along the shore, the roar of the rapid beside them the entire way, a sound like a jet engine that does not stop. It was, in its own way, a return to exactly what the survivors of the Brown expedition had done in 1889, and what Powell's men had done, and what the people who lived here had always done. When the water is too much, you get out and go around on the land, using your legs and your patience instead of your boat. The most modern river trip in the world, in the middle of the most controlled river in the country, had been handed back the oldest lesson in the canyon, and it had been handed it by a flood the dam was supposed to have abolished. I have to be careful here because the popular memory of Crystal in 1983 has grown well beyond the facts, and this story does not trade in exaggeration when the truth is already frightening enough. You will hear it said that many people died at Crystal that summer, that it was a slaughter, that the hole ate boat after boat and killed dozens. The documented record does not support that. The Tour West flip killed one passenger. The high water that summer was genuinely dangerous, and there were other flips and injuries and frightening swims in the canyon during those weeks. But the mass casualty catastrophe of legend did not happen. It matters that we get this right, because the real story is not that Crystal killed everyone. The real story is quieter and worse. Control did not cancel the flood. Control postponed it. For 20 years, the dam held back the spring surge, and an entire industry grew up in the calm behind that wall, believing, reasonably, that the Great June floods were a thing of the past. They were not gone. They were stored, accumulating behind the concrete, and in 1983 the reservoir gave 2 decades of them back in a single season, into rapids that had grown fat and vicious precisely because the annual floods had been absent to scour them. With more people in the canyon than had ever been there in history. The dam had not removed the danger. It had rescheduled it, hidden it, and let it compound in the dark, and then handed it back all at once. The people who run the river and the dam learned something from all of this, and their response is itself part of the story, because it is an admission of exactly the mechanism we have been describing. In 1996, and in a series of experiments in the years since, the Bureau of Reclamation and the Park Service began deliberately opening the dam to send controlled high flows down the canyon, engineered floods, timed to follow natural sediment inputs from the tributaries, specifically in an attempt to mimic the lost spring floods and rebuild the eroding sandbars and beaches. Think about what that means. Having built a dam to end the floods, the managers of the river now schedule artificial floods to try to replace, in small and imperfect measure, the very thing the dam took away. It is a quiet confession, written in cubic feet per second, that the natural flood was doing essential work no one fully valued until it was gone, and that a controlled flood is a pale and partial substitute for the real one. They can rebuild a little sand. They cannot restore the force that once kept Crystal from being Crystal. Now watch the trap keep working as the technology keeps improving. Because the next part of the story is about the one thing everyone assumes has finally conquered the wilderness: communication. If you can call for help instantly from anywhere on Earth, the reasoning goes, then remoteness stops mattering. A satellite phone at the bottom of the Grand Canyon means a hospital is one phone call away. Except it is not. And a single day in the spring of 2021 shows you exactly, cruelly, why. On the morning of April 26, 2021, a commercial trip was at Quagant Rapid, around mile 56, still deep in the upper canyon, where the walls stand highest and the river is most locked in. A 60-year-old passenger got into serious trouble in the water. At 11 Kwangs in the morning, the trip used a satellite phone to reach the outside world and report the emergency. That is the modern miracle working exactly as advertised. The signal went up, bounced off a satellite in orbit, and reached rescuers within minutes. In 1869 or 1889 or even 1966, getting word of an emergency out of that exact spot would have taken days of desperate climbing or floating to the nearest human being. In 2021, it took one phone call and the call was answered. Notice exactly what that signal can and cannot carry. A beacon or a satellite messenger sends a location and, at best, a short canned message, a pin on a map, and a few words. It does not send the river's mood at that spot, or the precise injury or whether the victim is breathing, or what the weather is doing in that one particular bend of the canyon. Rescuers often launch toward a dot on a screen without knowing what they will find when they get there, which shapes what they can bring and how hard they can commit. The technology closed the gap in knowing that something is wrong and roughly where. It did not close the gap in knowing what is wrong, and it did nothing at all about the gap that matters most, the physical distance a human being still has to travel to put their hands on the victim. We tend to feel that because we can summon help instantly, help is somehow already present, in a city with an ambulance minutes away. That feeling is roughly true. In the bottom of the Grand Canyon, it is a dangerous fiction, and the danger is precisely that the people carrying the beacon may believe, right up until the emergency, that the beacon itself is a form of safety, rather than merely a burst of speed in the very first link of a very long chain. And it mattered far less than you would think, because the message arriving instantly does not move the canyon walls. It does not shorten the miles of river and the rapids in between that separate the victim at mile 56 from the nearest rescue asset. The Park Service dispatched swiftwater rescue boats, and they launched that same day, as fast as anyone could ask. But launching and arriving are not remotely the same thing in a place like this. The rescue boats had to travel down the river, through the same rapids, and the same distance that make the canyon what it is, fighting the same water, and they did not reach the scene until the next morning. Overnight, in the canyon, the 60-year-old passenger died. The evacuation was not completed until April 28th, 2 days after that first instant phone call. The helicopter, which is the one tool that can actually beat the distance, could not fly. Weather grounded it. And that is the quiet, brutal fact underneath the entire modern era in this canyon. The fact that the phone in your hand is designed to make you forget. Communication became instant, and rescue distance stayed exactly the same. We solved the part of the problem that was easy to solve, the getting word out part, and we quietly told ourselves that solving it meant we had solved rescue. We had not. The signal travels at the speed of light. The rescuer travels at the speed of a boat fighting downstream through a rapid, or the speed of a helicopter that can only fly when the sky allows, or he does not travel at all. A phone at the bottom of the Grand Canyon connects you instantly to a world that still, physically, cannot reach you for a day or more. It can hear you. It cannot get to you. And knowing that help has been told, that it is coming, that it simply cannot arrive in time, is its own particular kind of horror for the people waiting in the dark by the water with someone who is dying. That night at Kwagun exposes a truth every guide carries, and most passengers never think about. On this river, your own group is the rescue. Not the helicopter, not the rangers, not the swiftwater team hours downstream. The handful of people in the boats beside you, right now. When someone goes into the water, it is those people who will pull them out, those people who will start the chest compressions, those people who will keep it up while a signal climbs to a satellite and the machinery of official rescue slowly begins to turn somewhere far away. The outside help is real, and it is coming, but it is measured in hours and sometimes in a full day, while the emergency is measured in minutes. Everyone who runs the canyon is, whether they ever signed up for the role or not, their own first responder, and often their own last one. That is why the good guides drill safety, why they place the throw ropes before anyone runs the drop, why they pick the conservative line above a bad rapid even when a bolder one would work. They are not being cautious for its own sake. They know that when it goes wrong down here, the cavalry does not arrive in time, because the cavalry physically cannot. There is only the boat, the cold water, and the people already in it. Which brings us, finally, all the way back to the body in the flat water and the beacon already in the air, and to Hance Rapid, mile 77, where this story opened and where its central mechanism is at last revealed. Because at Hance the communication worked, the flotation worked, the rescue came fast, the group did everything correctly, and people died anyway. 3 times. The same way, in the same order, with the same result, so that the Park Service had to write nearly the same words 3 times over. Hance is one of the older, larger rapids in the canyon. A long, steep, boulder-strewn drop with a fierce reputation, built the way they are all built, from a debris fan at the mouth of a side canyon, and then never flushed clean by any flood since the dam. At the top of Hance, the water accelerates over the fan and stacks into big waves and deep holes. And 3 times now, in June 2021, in March 2022, and in February 2026, a person has gone into the water at the top of that rapid, and the sequence has played out with an almost unbearable sameness each time. Crocker, on June 14, 2021, Kelly. On March 24, 2022, Benjamin. On February 19, 2026. In each case, the victim entered the water at or near the top of the rapid. In each case, the victim's own group, right there on the spot, pulled them out of the river within minutes. These were not people lost downstream for hours, not bodies searched for and found too late. These were people back on a boat or a rock, out of the current fast, faster than almost any rescue in the wild could hope for. In each case, CPR was begun immediately by the people around them, hands on the chest within minutes of the water. In each case, beacons went up, the signal reached the outside, and rangers were flown in. Everything that is supposed to save a life was done, and done quickly, by competent, present, equipped people. And in each case, resuscitation failed. Same rapid, same sequence, same wording in the notice. Look closely at the calendar of those 3 deaths, because it hides the whole argument in plain sight. Crocker died in the middle of June, in the heat of a canyon summer, when the air at the bottom can climb past 100 degrees. Kelly died in late March, in early spring. Benjamin died in the middle of February, in the dead of winter. 3 deaths spread across summer, spring, and the coldest month of the year, in water that was equally, lethally cold every single time. On a wild river, the June victim would have gone into warm, sun-heated water and very likely lived, and only a winter swimmer would have faced a cold like this. On the dammed river, there is no warm season and there is no safe month. The water comes off the bottom of the reservoir at close to the same temperature in July as in January, so the killer that waits at Hance never takes a summer off. That is why the season on the calendar changes, and the outcome on the page does not. The sun does not set the temperature of this river. A bank of intake gates 200 feet down in a reservoir sets it, and it holds it at the same cold number all year round. So what is the killer, if it is not drowning in the ordinary, long, thrashing, held-under sense, not remoteness, not the failure of any equipment or any person to respond? The killer is the temperature of the water, and the specific, well-documented way that cold attacks a human body in the first seconds and the first minute. And it is the final piece of the trap the piece the dam delivers directly. The water at Hants is around 50 degrees, cold water pulled from deep in Lake Powell and carried down the canyon by the dam. Cold in June exactly as much as in December. When a human body is suddenly plunged into water that cold, without time to prepare, it does not simply begin to feel chilly and slowly grow weak. It goes through a sequence that physiologists who study cold water immersion have mapped precisely. A sequence with 4 stages, and it is the very first stage, not the last, that does most of the killing. That first stage is called the cold shock response, and it hits in the first seconds and lasts a couple of minutes, long before hypothermia is even a factor. The instant the cold hits the skin, the body forces a huge, involuntary, uncontrollable gasp, an enormous breath sucked in whether you want it or not. If your head happens to be underwater when that gasp fires, and in the churning water at the top of a rapid it very well may be, you inhale water straight into your lungs in the first instant, before you have understood that anything is wrong. Immediately after the gasp comes uncontrollable hyperventilation, a rapid, panicked breathing you cannot suppress, which makes it nearly impossible to hold your breath, to time a breath to the surface between waves, to do any of the calm, deliberate things a swimmer would do. At the same time, your heart rate and blood pressure spike violently, which is a danger of its own, especially for an older person or anyone with a weak heart. That is the first minute. And it can drown a strong swimmer before they have swum a stroke. Then comes the second stage, and its name tells you everything: cold incapacitation or swim failure. Over the next few minutes in cold water, the cold reaches the nerves and muscles of your arms and legs and begins to shut them down. Cold muscle does not contract properly. Cold nerve does not carry the signal properly. Your hands stop gripping. Your arms and legs, no matter how fit you are, no matter how hard your mind is screaming at them, stop doing what you tell them. You lose the physical ability to swim, to hold onto a rope, to pull yourself onto a boat. And you lose it fast, often within a few minutes, often long before your body temperature has dropped enough to be called hypothermia at all. Only after all of that, if you have somehow survived the gasp and the swim failure, does the third stage, actual hypothermia, slowly set in over half an hour or more, and a fourth stage, a collapse that can strike even during and after rescue, waits behind it. But most cold water deaths never reach the hypothermia stage. They happen in the first minute or the first few minutes, in the cold shock and the swim failure, at the top of the rapid, in the churn. Now understand exactly what the life jacket does and does not do inside that sequence, because this is the cruel heart of the whole thing. The life jacket is buoyancy, and only buoyancy. It keeps a body floating at the surface. It does that job perfectly, exactly as designed. But buoyancy is not breathing, and buoyancy is not consciousness, and buoyancy is not muscle control. The jacket holds you up. It does not stop the gasp reflex from pulling water into your lungs in the first shocked second. It does not make your cold locked arms work so you can climb out. It does not keep your heart steady or your mind clear when your whole system is in physiological shock. So the jacket does precisely what it promises: keeps the body at the surface. And in doing so, it delivers a person to their own rescuers at the surface within minutes, having already inhaled water or already lost the ability to protect their own airway in the first shocked seconds up at the top. That is why the group can pull them out so fast and still lose them. That is why the beacon can work and the Rangers can fly in, and the CPR can start within minutes, and none of it changes the outcome. The lethal event already happened. In the first 60 seconds, in 50-degree water, at the top of the rapid, and everything after that, the fast rescue, the CPR, the helicopter, is a response arriving after the person is, in the ways that decide life and death, already gone. The jacket kept a body afloat. It could not keep a person conscious. Understanding that changes how you see the rescue itself. Stay with what the people on the scene are actually facing, because they are not incompetent and they are not slow. When a person is pulled from cold water not breathing, the rescuers around them, whether trained guides or the passengers themselves, are already in a fight the physiology has half decided. They start chest compressions, they try to force air in, they do it in a pitching boat or on a rocky bank in the bottom of a canyon, and they keep doing it while a beacon climbs and a helicopter is requested and rangers are launched. There is a hard principle in cold water medicine that says a person is not dead until they are warm and dead, meaning that deep cold can so slow the body that resuscitation is sometimes possible even after downtimes that would be hopeless in warm water. And that principle is exactly why trained rescuers keep working and keep working long past the point that instinct says to stop. It offers real hope in some cases, and people have been brought back from cold water who by every ordinary measure should have been gone. But it is not magic. It cannot reverse water already breathed deep into the lungs in the first shocked second, and it cannot restart a heart that failed in the initial cold shock spike in blood pressure. There is even a danger inside the rescue itself, something clinicians call circumrescue collapse, where the act of pulling a severely chilled person out of the water, changing their position, letting cold blood from the limbs wash back toward the core and the heart, can itself trigger a fatal collapse in the very moments during or just after they are saved. So the picture is not one of clumsy rescuers fumbling an easy save. It is one of skilled, desperate people doing everything correctly against a process that 50-degree water set in motion before their hands ever reached the victim. The CPR at Hants was not too slow. It began within minutes. It was simply too late by the time it began, because the clock that decided the outcome had started at the top of the rapid and run out in under a minute. And here is the part that closes the loop back to the dam. The part that makes this a story about control and not just about cold. The final killer is the water temperature, and the water temperature is not natural. A wild, undammed Colorado in June would be warm on top, muddy and sun-warmed, maybe in the 60s or 70s at the surface in the summer heat. A person flipped into that river in June would be cold and shocked, yes, but nothing like the cold shock of 50-degree water. And their muscles would keep working far longer. And their odds of surviving a fast rescue in a life jacket would be far, far higher. The dam is what makes the water 50 degrees in June. The dam, drawing its releases from the deep cold at the bottom of the reservoir, hands the canyon its single most efficient killer and hands it out every day of the year, summer, and winter alike. The same wall of concrete that made the river predictable, that ended the floods, that let the rapids grow unchecked, that starved the beaches, also chilled the water to the exact temperature that converts a survivable swim in a life jacket into a death in the flat pool below the drop. That is why the same death notice keeps getting written at mile 77. The rapid is the same. The water temperature is the same. The physiology is the same. The wording never had to change because nothing that kills at Hants has changed. It is all working exactly as built. This is the system then, laid out in full and locked together. Geography built a main canyon fed by hundreds of steep side canyons, each one a loaded ramp pointed at the river. Weather, in the form of storms on the rim that the river's surface never feels, sends debris flows down those side canyons and dumps boulder fans into the river, building the rapids as points, not as a smear, at a different time and place from where the victims will meet them. Human ambition, first a railroad, then an industry, put people onto the water treating it as a route, when the people who knew it best had always wisely treated it as a barrier. Technology kept appearing to solve the problem: oak boats and cork preservers, then a dam, then satellite phones and beacons and rescue helicopters, and each solution genuinely fixed one thing while leaving another untouched, or, in the dam's case, while quietly making three other things worse. And distance, the plain physical fact of miles of walled river between a victim and any help, has never been solved at all, because a signal is not a rescuer, and a phone call cannot cross a rapid or fly through a storm. The dam sits over all of it, the great engine of the modern canyon, having made the river feel safe, while ensuring the rapids only grow. The floods return on their own terrible schedule. The camps erode, and the water stays cold enough to kill a healthy swimmer in a minute. People keep coming, though, because the reasons they come are every bit as real as the reasons they die, and any honest telling has to say so. It is one of the great landscapes of the earth, and floating the length of the Grand Canyon is one of the great experiences a human being can have. And the overwhelming majority of the tens of thousands who run it every year come out the far end at the Grand Wash Cliffs changed, and alive, and grateful, having touched something most people never will. That is true, and it must be said plainly, because the trap is not a curse, and the river is not evil, and the guides are not reckless. The trap is a machine, and most people pass through the machine without triggering the specific parts that kill. But the parts are always there, always loaded, waiting at the points, and every season some small number of people, most of them doing almost everything right, wearing the jacket, listening to the guide, out of the water in minutes, find the one part that no oar and no beacon and no helicopter can undo. Their numbers climb every decade, which is the quiet engine behind all the statistics. The same predictability that the dam created, the steady flow, the known schedule, the professional outfitters is exactly what turned a fringe adventure into a mainstream one. A trip that ordinary people plan for years and save for and cross off a list. Many of them are older, drawn precisely because it is now sold as manageable, a guided journey through one of the wonders of the world, rather than a gamble with a wild river. That is not foolishness. It is the entirely rational response to a place that has been, in every visible way, brought under control. The trip is guided, the boats are good, the guides are superb, the food is packed, the flow is known, the emergency beacon is in the dry box. Every signal a reasonable person reads says this is safe. And it is, overwhelmingly, most of the time, for most people. But the very success of that message is what keeps loading the canyon with human beings, tens of thousands a year, each of them carried past the same points where the cold water and the constricted current wait, indifferent to how well the trip was planned. The safer the river is made to feel, the more people it draws, and the more people it draws, the more of them are present, the small fraction of times the trap actually closes. Control did not lower the exposure. Control raised it by inviting everyone in. One thing has to be said plainly, because the numbers can make it sound otherwise. The people who run this river for a living are extraordinarily good at their jobs. The commercial guides of the Grand Canyon are among the most skilled boat handlers anywhere on Earth. People who have read these rapids thousands of times, who can place a heavy loaded boat exactly where they want it, in water that would kill an amateur in minutes, who spend their whole seasons watching the sky and the flow and the faces of their passengers for the first hint of trouble. The overwhelming majority of the tens of thousands of people who float the canyon safely every year owe that safety directly to those guides. When a death happens anyway, it is almost never because a guide was careless. It is because the trap found the one gap that skill cannot close. The healthy-seeming passenger whose heart could not take the cold shock, the freak swim into the wrong hole, the single second that went wrong faster than any human hand could reach. And the rangers who fly into the canyon to those emergencies carry their own weight out of it, because they are the ones who arrive after the CPR has failed, who confirm what the cold already decided, who help write the notice that will read almost exactly like the last one and the one before that. There is a particular kind of exhaustion in doing everything right and losing anyway. In knowing that the beacon worked, and the flotation worked, and the response was fast, and the person is still gone. And that exhaustion sits behind the flat, careful language of every fatality release the park has ever had to post. The sameness of the wording is not indifference, and it is not laziness. It is the sound of competent people who have run out of new things to say about a mechanism that refuses to change. They are not failing. They are being asked to outmuscle physics with their bare hands in the bottom of a mile-deep canyon, in water kept at 50 degrees by a wall 200 miles upstream, and sometimes through no fault of anyone present. Physics wins. You can measure how hard the system pushes back against every attempt to manage it just by looking at what it takes to run search and rescue in the Grand Canyon today. This is not a place with an occasional emergency. In a typical year, the park handles somewhere around 300 search and rescue incidents and performs on the order of 140 helicopter evacuations. Read those numbers slowly. 140 times a year on average, the situation is bad enough and a ground rescue impossible enough that the only answer is to fly a helicopter into the canyon and lift someone out by air. Grand Canyon is, as far as such things are tracked, the only national park that keeps its own dedicated search and rescue helicopter stationed on site year-round, not as a luxury, but as the baseline tool of survival, because the distances in the walls make an aircraft the difference between a rescue and a recovery. In 1996, the park recorded a staggering 482 search and rescue incidents in a single year, a number so high it forced a rethinking of the whole approach, and out of that came the Preventive Search and Rescue Program, an effort to stop emergencies before they start by intercepting overmatched hikers and boaters, handing out water, turning people back, catching the small mistake before the canyon turns it into a large one. The most effective rescue, the park had concluded, is the one that never has to happen, because the ones that do happen are so hard, so expensive, and so often too late. It helps to lay out what a rescue in this canyon actually requires, step by step, because the easy phrase call for help hides an enormous amount of distance and time. First, someone has to recognize that there is an emergency and get a signal out, which today usually means a satellite messenger, a beacon, or a sat phone. And that part, at last, is genuinely fast. Then the message has to reach the right people, and a decision has to be made about what to send, a river team, a helicopter, or both, which requires knowing where in the 277 miles the emergency actually is, and what the weather is doing there specifically, which can be nothing like the weather at the rim. Then the response has to be prepared and authorized and launched, crews assembled, aircraft readied, and only then does the actual travel begin. And the travel is the part no technology has shortened. A helicopter, if it can fly, crosses in a reasonable time what a boat needs many hours or a full day to reach. If the helicopter cannot fly, because of heat, wind, darkness, or low cloud sitting in the gorge, then the only option is the river itself, and a rescue boat moving downstream is bound by the same current and the same rapids as everyone else on the water. Once the responders arrive, they still have to approach the victim across difficult water or terrain, and then accomplish the transfer, getting an injured or unconscious person into a boat, or into a litter, or up to a hovering helicopter on a hoist line, which in a tight, hot, wind-scoured gorge is often the most dangerous single part of the whole operation for everyone involved. Every one of those steps takes time, and time in cold water or in canyon heat is precisely what the victim does not have. This is the chain that stayed long even after its very first link became instant. And there is essentially one door in the entire corridor. Near the midpoint of the canyon, around mile 88, a pair of trails climbs from the river up to the south rim, crossing the Colorado on two footbridges by a cluster of cabins called Phantom Ranch, where there is a ranger presence and a mule trail to the top. It is the only place in the whole 277 miles where a person can realistically walk out to a road, and even that walk is a brutal climb of nearly a vertical mile, hours of it, exposed in canyon heat, the kind of climb that sends healthy people into cardiac trouble on its own. For someone injured or unconscious, it is no exit at all. Above Phantom Ranch and below it, for scores of miles in each direction, there is no practical trail out, no road, no town, nothing but the river going forward and the walls going up. When guides say you are committed the moment you launch, this is what they mean in hard geography. Between Lee's Ferry and the far end, the river offers you exactly one modest chance to change your mind and climb back into the world. It sits near the middle, and it is a mule trail. Everywhere else, getting a hurt person out means a boat that takes the better part of a day, or a helicopter that may not be able to fly. To grasp why so many people are exposed to that chain, you have to see how many of them are down there, and how recent that crowd really is. For the better part of a century after Powell, running the Grand Canyon remained something only a tiny handful of people had ever done, a feat measured in individuals rather than in thousands. Through the first half of the 20th century, the entire number of people who had floated the canyon could be counted, roughly, in the dozens. And many of them were serious expedition men and a few remarkable individualists who treated the river as a genuine gamble with their lives. It was not a vacation. It was closer to climbing a hard, unclimbed peak, an undertaking with a real chance of not coming back. Then came the dam, and the steady flow, and the modern raft, and the guiding business, and within a single generation, the canyon went from a place a few dozen people had ever seen from the water to a place tens of thousands see every year. That is one of the fastest transformations of a wilderness into a destination in American history. And it happened not because the river grew safer in its bones, but because it grew predictable on its surface. And predictability is exactly what an industry needs. The rapids did not soften. The water did not warm. The distance did not shrink. Only the schedule became knowable, and on that single change, an entire industry and an entire flood of human exposure was built. After the dam made the river predictable, the demand to float the Grand Canyon grew so large that the Park Service had to ration it. For decades, the private permit to launch your own trip carried a waiting list so long, well over a decade in the worst years, that people signed up in their 30s and finally launched in their 50s. And the system was eventually rebuilt into a weighted lottery just to make the wait bearable. The commercial trips, run by licensed outfitters, launch on a managed schedule through the running season, and a full-length trip from Lee's Ferry down through the canyon can take 2 weeks or more on an oar-powered boat, somewhat less on the big motor rigs. Tens of thousands of people ride the river every year through this system, a great many of them older, retired, finally taking the trip of a lifetime, which is to say exactly the population most vulnerable to a sudden cold shock heart event. The permit system exists to protect the canyon from crowding and to protect people from the chaos of an unregulated river, and it does both. What it cannot do is change the physics waiting at each point for whichever of those thousands of people happens to go into the water at the wrong second. Management can decide how many people enter the trap. It cannot disarm the trap. But even the helicopter, the one tool that beats the distance, is not free of the canyon's rules. And this is the final turn of the knife. The same conditions that put people in danger are frequently the conditions that keep the helicopter on the ground. Heat thins the air, and thin air robs a helicopter of the lift it needs to fly and to hover and to carry weight. So on the hottest days, exactly when heat emergencies among hikers spike toward their peak, the aircraft can lift less, and in the tightest, deepest, hottest parts of the inner gorge, it sometimes cannot safely operate at all. Wind funneling and accelerating through the canyon corridor does the same, turning the air into something the machine cannot fly through. Weather grounds it outright, as it did at Kwagunt in 2021 while a man was dying at mile 56. So even the modern miracle, the year-round on-site rescue helicopter, has a ceiling. And the ceiling comes down at the exact moment's demand goes up. The tool that beats distance is defeated by heat and wind, the same forces that fill the canyon with victims in the first place. There is no clean way out of the system. Every solution, followed far enough, runs back into the same wall it was meant to climb over. The canyon does not only kill by cold water. Up out of the gorge, on the trails that drop from the rim toward the river, it kills the opposite way, by heat. And the two dangers turn out to be mirror images of the same trap. A hiker starts down on a cool morning at the rim, feeling strong, going downhill, and every step carries them into air that grows hotter as they descend, further from water, and closer to the point where they no longer have the strength or the fluid to climb back out in the heat of the day. Going down is easy and feels safe, and that is exactly the illusion. Because the hard part, the climb out, comes later, in worse heat, with less left in the tank. It is the same structure as the river. The danger is backloaded, hidden behind an easy and pleasant beginning. And by the time it finally announces itself, the options have already narrowed to almost nothing. This is what the Preventive Search and Rescue Program was built to interrupt. Rangers and volunteers posted on the trails and at the trailheads through the hot months watch for the people moving too fast, carrying too little water, dressed wrong, heading too far down too late in the morning, and they step in early, with water, with shade, with a blunt conversation, turning people back before the canyon turns them into a rescue. It is unglamorous, patient work, and it is the single most effective safety measure anyone has ever found in this place, precisely because it attacks the trap where the trap is weakest, at the beginning, before the options are gone, instead of at the end, when the only tool left is a helicopter that may not even be able to fly. And the river is not finished building rapids. That is the last turn of the whole story, and it comes almost 300 miles downstream at the very bottom of the canyon, in a place that proves the entire mechanism all over again from a direction absolutely nobody expected. At mile 280.5, near where the canyon finally opens out toward what used to be the still, drowned water at the head of Lake Mead, there is a rapid called Pierce Ferry. And here's the thing about Pierce Ferry Rapid. For most of the history of river running, it did not exist. This was flat water, the slack pool at the top of the reservoir, the place where the river's current died into the lake and trips simply floated the last miles to a takeout with the engine off. Then Lake Mead began to fall. 2 decades of drought across the Colorado Basin, combined with more water promised to more users than the river actually carries, dropped the reservoir dramatically year after year, exposing a bathtub ring of pale rock, and below it, mile after mile of the fine sediment the reservoir had been quietly collecting for half a century, deep, soft beds of mud and silt where a lake used to be. There is a deeper strangeness here worth naming. When Lake Mead was full, held back by Hoover Dam far downstream and once the largest reservoir in the country, its water reached far up into the bottom of the Grand Canyon, drowning miles of what had once been living river under still, silent reservoir. For decades, that stretch was simply lake, flat and dead, its old current gone, its old rapids buried. As the reservoir fell through the long drought of the early 21st century, the river came back to life in ground that had been lake bed, flowing again where nothing had flowed for 2 generations, except now it was flowing across the thick beds of soft sediment the still water had spent all those decades laying down. A river with the full momentum of a river, arriving at the head of a soft, flat, drowned plain, and finding a slope to run down. That is the exact recipe for a Nick Point, and the river set to work on it immediately. And the river did what rivers do to soft ground with a slope to run down. It began to cut. Since roughly 2003, as Lake Mead retreated, the Colorado has carved an entirely new rapid at Pierce Ferry, and it is not built the way any of the others are built. There is no debris fan here, no boulder pile delivered from a side canyon by a storm. This is a Nick Point, a step in the riverbed, the sharp leading edge of a river actively cutting down into old reservoir sediment and working its way upstream, deepening and steepening as it goes, eating backward into the drowned lake bed. It behaves nothing like the debris fan rapids far upstream. It is not a pile of rock the river has to fight over. It is a cliff of soft sediment the river is carving down into in real time, and it turned dangerous enough, fast enough, that running it in an ordinary river craft became something close to suicidal, a place where boats break and people can die. The Park Service response tells you exactly how seriously they took a rapid that had not existed a few years earlier. Around 2010, they spent roughly $1 million extending Pierce Ferry Road so that river trips could reach a takeout point above the new rapid, get off the water before it, and drive out, avoiding the Nick Point entirely. A brand new rapid, appearing in the 21st century in water that had been a placid reservoir arm within living memory, requiring $1 million road just to let people get away from it. And the mechanism that built it is the same mechanism we started with, wearing different clothes. A storm on the rim builds a rapid by dumping rock into the river over an afternoon. A shrinking reservoir builds a rapid by pulling the water off soft ground and letting the freed river cut a step into it over years. One is fast and one is slow. One comes from the top of the canyon and one from the bottom. But both are the landscape changing underneath the people who float it. And both prove the same thing the December storm of 1966 proved. The map was never fixed. The canyon has been building its traps the entire time, from above by storm and now from below by drought. And it has not stopped. And there is no reason to think it will. Step back and look at the whole canyon at once, and you see something almost too neat to be an accident. It is bracketed top and bottom by two of the largest reservoirs ever built in North America. At the head sits Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Powell, and at the foot downstream, Hoover Dam and Lake Mead. And each of those reservoirs, from its own end, builds rapids in the canyon between them. The upstream dam builds them by subtraction, by taking away the annual flood that once swept the debris fans clean, so the rapids grow and never reset. The downstream reservoir builds them by retreat, by pulling its water back and exposing soft sediment for the freed river to carve into. One dam builds a rapid by holding water back. One reservoir builds a rapid by letting water go. From opposite ends, by opposite means, the two great works of control that were meant to tame this river are each quietly manufacturing the very hazard the river is famous for. That is the deepest irony of the place. And it is not a figure of speech. It is hydrology. The most managed river corridor in the country is producing fresh dangers at both of its ends precisely because of the management. And the people floating the miles between the two reservoirs are floating through the consequences of both. So here is where the river leaves us, with every open question of this story now closed. People drown in the smooth water below the rapids because the cold shocks them in the first minute at the top, and the flat pool downstream is only where their bodies, held up by the very jackets that could not save them, finally rise to the surface. The dam removed the annual flood that used to sweep the debris fans away and renew the beaches, which is why the rapids only grow and the camps only shrink, and why in 1983 and again in the years since, the managers have had to open the gates and try to fake a flood the river used to make for free. The same rapid appears 3 times in the Park Service's death notices because the killer at Hants is not the rock or the speed of the water, but its temperature. And the temperature does not change from one victim to the next, delivered cold and constant from the bottom of a reservoir. And what is forming at mile 280 right now is a new rapid, cutting a little deeper into old reservoir mud with each passing season. Proof, standing in the water, that the machine is still running, that a shrinking reservoir builds rapids just as surely as a storm does. Picture it then, both ends of the canyon at once, because that is the honest final image of this place. And it is not triumphant, and it is not a lesson about nature humbling man. It is just true. Down at mile 280, in water that a single lifetime ago was the flat surface of a reservoir, the new rapid at Pierce Ferry is eating backward into the old lake sediment, a little deeper this year than last, a step in the river that did not exist when most of today's guides were born, growing on its own patient schedule, indifferent to all of it. And far upstream, at mile 77, above Hants, a scouting party stands on a debris fan, the same kind of boulder pile a storm delivered out of a side canyon long ago and no flood has ever cleared, and studies the water, reading the line through the drop, choosing the route they will run. They are good at it. They have done it before, many times, and they will very likely run it clean and float on down to camp in the last of the light. But the fan shifts one storm at a time, and the flow changes with a decision made in an office hundreds of miles upstream, and the line they are reading today will be a different line next year. They are standing on a trap that a storm built and a dam keeps loaded, reading water that is exactly 50 degrees. And the only thing any of them can do, the only thing anyone has ever been able to do here, is read it well and push off and go.